The heart functions as two separate pumps. The right side of the heart pumps blood into the pulmonary circuit. This consists of blood vessels that carry the blood from the right side of the heart to the lungs for gas exchange, and then back to the left side of the heart. The left side of the heart pumps blood into the systemic circuit. This circuit consists of blood vessels that carry blood from the left side of the heart to the tissues for gas exchange, and then back to the right side of the heart. In addition, there is a third circuit called the coronary circuit. This carries blood to the heart tissue to supply it. Blood going through the chambers of the heart does not supply the heart tissue. The heart is located in the mediastinum, which is the area between the two pleural cavities that house the lungs. Within the mediastinum, there is a pericardial cavity, which houses the heart. The heart is located between the second rib and the fifth intercostal space. This is the space between the fifth and the sixth ribs. It is about the size of your fist and shaped like an upside-down cone. The broad part of the heart is called the base, and it's the superior portion of the heart. The pointed part of the heart is called the apex, and that is the inferior portion of the heart. The apex is oriented toward your left hip. At the tip of the apex, you can hear the apical pulse. To listen to this, you can place the stethoscope below the left nipple. The coverings of the heart are called the pericardium. It is a double-layered sac. The superficial or outer layer is called the fibrous pericardium. It consists of connective tissue, fibrous connective tissue. It anchors the heart, protects it, and prevents it from overfilling. Deep to that is the serous membranes. It consists of two layers. The outer or superficial layer, the parietal pericardium, and the inner or deeper layer, the visceral pericardium. The visceral pericardium clings to the surface of the heart. The term viscera refers to the organs in the ventral cavity. The space in between the two serous membranes is called the pericardial cavity, and it is filled with a serous fluid called the pericardial fluid. This fluid prevents friction from occurring when the heart contracts and relaxes. The heart wall consists of three layers. The superficial or outer layer is called the epicardium and is highlighted in green. The epicardium is the same as the visceral pericardium when it is clinging to the surface of the heart. The second layer is the myocardium. This is the thickest layer and consists of cardiac muscle cells. Within the ventricles, the muscle cells are arranged into columns or ridges called trabeculae carneae, visible at the tip of the arrow in the lower left-hand corner of this slide. Cardiac muscle cells are held together or anchored by connective tissue. This connective tissue is neutral and does not allow action potentials to travel through it, and it makes up the cardiac skeleton. The contractile cardiac muscle cells of the ventricles are arranged into circular or spiral bundles. This allows the contraction of the ventricles to begin at the apex and move upward. The semilunar valves, which are between the ventricles and the arteries that drain them, are located at the top of the ventricles. This structure allows more blood to be ejected from the ventricles when they contract. Let's continue looking at the layers of the heart wall. The third or inner layer of the heart wall is called the endocardium, and it is continuous with the endothelium of the blood vessels. It consists of simple squamous epithelium and lines the chambers. So let's review. This is the fibrous pericardium, and attached to it is the parietal layer of the serous pericardium. The visceral pericardium clings to the surface of the heart, and the space in between the parietal and the visceral pericardia is called the pericardial cavity. The myocardium is the cardiac muscle layer in the wall, and the inner layer is called the endocardium, lining the chambers. What's outlined in black consists of the three layers of the heart wall. Let's look at the internal anatomy of the heart. The heart consists of 4 chambers. The 2 upper chambers are the receiving chambers, and they are called the atria, a right atrium and a left atrium. The right atrium receives blood from the systemic circuit. The left atrium receives blood from the pulmonary circuit. In addition, the atria have pig-like ear structures that extend the volume of the atria, called auricles. I've drawn one in purple. Inside the atria are ridges or columns of cardiac muscle called pectinate muscles. These are obvious in the auricles. The fossa ovalis is a remnant of a hole that existed during fetal development called the foramen ovale. This hole allowed blood to go directly from the right atrium into the left atrium to bypass the lungs, since the fetal lungs are non-functional. The wall in between the 2 atria is called the interatrial septum. The 2 lower chambers are called the ventricles. They are ejecting chambers, meaning that they pump the blood out of the heart. The right ventricle pumps the blood or ejects the blood into the pulmonary circuit. The left ventricle ejects the blood into the systemic circuit. The colors represent whether the blood is highly or poorly oxygenated. Blue will represent poorly oxygenated blood, and red will represent highly oxygenated blood. Blood returning to the right atrium is low in oxygen since it is returning from the tissues. It then is carried to the lungs to pick up oxygen and unload carbon dioxide. When the blood returns back to the left side of the heart, it is rich in oxygen. So the left side of the heart pumps highly oxygenated blood into the systemic circuit so that the oxygen can go to the tissues. The wall in between the ventricles is called the interventricular septum, and this is where much of the intrinsic conduction pathway is located. A significant size difference occurs between the left ventricular myocardium and the right ventricular myocardium. This is due to the fact that the left ventricle has a greater afterload it must overcome. Recall that afterload is related to the pressure in the arteries that drain the ventricles. The pressure in the aorta is greater than in the pulmonary trunk. Therefore, the left ventricle must create a greater pressure to open up the semilunar valves than the right ventricle must. Let's look at some external landmarks. The coronary sulcus is a groove between the atria and the ventricles. The interventricular sulci, and this is plural because there is an anterior one and a posterior one, will be located between the ventricles. There are 2 different types of valves in the heart. The atrioventricular valves are between the atria and the ventricles. The right AV valve is called the tricuspid valve because it has 3 cusps. The left AV valve is called the bicuspid valve or the mitral valve. It will have two cusps. The valves are attached to structures called papillary muscles by chordae tendineae. This consists of collagen fibers and are known as your heartstrings. I've highlighted the papillary muscles. They look like little mountains. The chordae tendineae and the papillary muscle do not open up the AV valves. All they do is prevent the valves from everting, in other words, opening in the wrong direction. The valves simply open based on pressure gradients, like a swinging door. When the pressure is greater in the atria, and we're talking about the pressure of the blood in the chamber, when the pressure is greater in the atria than in the ventricles, the AV valves open. Blood will move into the ventricles. This will lead to a drop in the pressure within the atria and an increase in the pressure in the ventricles. When this occurs, the AV valves close. The semilunar valves are named because they consist of three cusps that look like half moons. They are located between the ventricles and the arteries that drain the ventricles. The pulmonary semilunar valve is between the right ventricle and the pulmonary trunk artery that drains the right ventricle. Notice this artery is blue because the blood is still poorly oxygenated. It has to go to the lungs first to pick up oxygen. The aortic semilunar valve is located between the left ventricle and the aorta artery. Blood going through this valve will be rich in oxygen. It has returned from the lungs. Incompetent valves are valves that do not remain closed. Valvular stenosis are valves that are stiff and difficult to open. This figure helps explain how the heart valves open. As mentioned before, they open along pressure gradients. Starting at the upper left, blood returning back to the heart fills the atria. The pressure within the atria increases. As soon as the pressure in the atria is greater than the ventricular pressure, the AV valves open and blood moves into the ventricles. As soon as the blood moves into the ventricles and the atrial pressure drops, the AV valves will close. Both sets of valves, the AV and the semilunar valves, will be closed. The ventricles will contract to increase the pressure in the ventricles. As soon as ventricular pressure is greater than the arterial pressure, the semilunar valves open and blood is ejected from the ventricles. When the blood leaves the ventricles, the pressure in the ventricles will drop and become lower than the pressure in the arteries that drain them. There will be a little backwash of blood, and you'll notice that in the lower right-hand corner, you can see the cusp of the semilunar valves. There are two visible there. When there is a backwash of blood, the blood fills the little cups and keeps the semilunar valves closed. Let's look at the blood vessels that are associated with the heart. Before beginning with identifying these blood vessels, let's look at what is a vein and what is an artery. Veins are vessels that carry blood toward the heart. They return blood to the heart. Arteries carry blood away from the heart. The veins within the pulmonary circuit carry blood to the heart from the lungs. This blood, since it's returning from the lungs, will be rich in oxygen. The veins in the systemic circuit carry blood toward the heart from the tissues. This blood will be low in oxygen. Arteries within the pulmonary circuit carry blood away from the heart toward the lungs. The blood in the pulmonary arteries will therefore be low in oxygen. Blood going to the tissues from the heart will be high in oxygen. The main systemic artery is the aorta, and it drains the left ventricle. The main pulmonary artery is the pulmonary trunk, and it drains the right ventricle. The pulmonary trunk will branch into pulmonary arteries, taking the blood to the lungs for gas exchange, picking up oxygen and getting rid of carbon dioxide. The vena cava veins return blood back to the right atrium from the systemic circuit or the tissues. There is the superior vena cava returning blood from the upper part of the body, and an inferior vena cava returning blood from the lower part of the body. The pulmonary veins, and there are 4 of them, will be returning blood back from the lungs rich in oxygen. They will empty into the left atrium. The pulmonary arteries are taking blood away from the heart. Recall that they are branches of the pulmonary trunk artery. You will need to be able to trace blood flow through the heart. The blood returns back to the right atrium by the superior and the inferior vena cava. From the right atrium, it goes through the tricuspid or right AV valve into the right ventricle. It then leaves the heart, going through the pulmonary semilunar valve into the pulmonary trunk artery, which then branches into your right and left pulmonary arteries, carrying the blood to the lungs to pick up oxygen and to get rid of carbon dioxide. The blood then returns back to the heart by way of pulmonary veins. However, this blood is rich in oxygen since it is returning from the lungs. Therefore, you'll notice that these veins are red. From the pulmonary veins, 2 from each lung, the blood will move into the left atrium through the bicuspid or mitral valve into the left ventricle, through the aortic semilunar valve into the aorta, which is part of the systemic circuit. This oxygen-rich blood then will be transported to your tissues for aerobic cellular respiration, as well as to transport nutrients and other substances. This is a flow chart which may be helpful. It does exactly what I just talked about. The colors again represent whether the blood is highly or poorly oxygenated. Red is for highly oxygenated, and blue is for poorly oxygenated blood. Recall that there are 3 circuits: the pulmonary circuit, systemic circuit, and coronary circuit. Let's look at the coronary circuit. Blood flowing through the chambers of the heart does not supply the heart tissue. Blood must return back from the lungs rich in oxygen before it can supply the heart tissue. Look at the heart on the right. The purple dot is on the ascending aorta artery. The ascending describes the flow of the blood. From there, the blood moves into the aortic arch. So this part of the aorta is called the aortic arch artery. It then starts moving downward, posterior to the heart, in the descending aorta. Let's begin with the coronary circuit. The first 2 branches that come off of the ascending aorta are the coronary arteries. There is a right one and a left one. We're going to follow the right one first. The right coronary artery moves along the coronary sulcus, which is between the right atrium and the right ventricle. There is a lateral branch that comes off of it called the right marginal artery. The left coronary artery continues deep to the pulmonary trunk. In other words, it goes underneath it. On the other side of the pulmonary trunk, It branches. The branch going down anteriorly along the anterior interventricular sulcus is called the anterior interventricular artery. Remember, the term inter means between. The other branch coming off of the left coronary artery goes along the coronary sulcus toward the posterior surface of the heart. There is one other vessel that I want you to know, and that is the posterior interventricular artery, going along the posterior interventricular sulcus. Let's look at the veins now. The veins are draining the heart tissue and returning the blood back to the right atrium of the heart. We'll begin with the great cardiac vein, which lies within the anterior interventricular sulcus. It runs parallel to the anterior interventricular artery. Blood from there will flow into the coronary sinus. In addition, there is a small cardiac vein near to the right marginal artery and a middle cardiac vein along the posterior interventricular sulcus. All of these veins will empty into a coronary sinus vein, which returns the blood back to the right atrium of the heart. So the right atrium of the heart is receiving blood from three vessels: the superior and the inferior vena cava, returning blood from the systemic circuit, and the coronary sinus, returning blood from the coronary circuit. The coronary circulation contains numerous anastomoses. These are blood vessels that connect via collateral branches or vessels. If the collateral branches connect two arteries, it is called an arterial anastomosis, and that is illustrated in the upper right part. If the anastomosis is between two veins, it is a venous anastomosis, as seen in the lower right heart. You can also have an anastomosis between an artery and a vein, and that will be called an arterial venous anastomosis. Myocardial ischemia is decreased oxygen to the cardiac muscle cells. Cardiac muscle cells synthesize over 95% of their ATP aerobically. Sometimes pain can be associated with this ischemia, and this is called angina pectoris. A heart attack is called a myocardial infarction. When this occurs, cardiac muscle cells die. Infarct means to die. This is the end of the video for Lab 2 on the heart.